There are four main types of seventh chord that feature in major and minor keys. There are also many more chords that use the number 7, but these are beyond the scope of this video. Seventh chords are a powerful and versatile group to write songs with, so in this video I'm going to walk you through the process from start to finish. Let's start with the major seventh chord. Triads are chords with 3 notes. They include major, minor, augmented and diminished chords. The distance between 2 notes are called intervals. In Western music, these are typically measured with the smallest interval, which is called a half step or semitone. This is the distance from one key to the next on piano, or from one fret to the next on guitar. Major triads are built with a root note, a major third interval, and a perfect fifth interval. You'll see this written as 1, 3, 5. Major third intervals span 4 half steps. Perfect fifth intervals span 7 half steps. Let's build a C major triad to see this in action. Start on the root note, which in this case is C. Count up 4 half steps from C. This is the note E. This is your third note. Go back to C and count up 7 half steps. This note is G, which is the 5th note. So C major is constructed with the notes C, E and G. This process of constructed triads is also known as stacking thirds. You saw this with the first 2 notes, a major third apart. The distance from the 3rd note to the 5th is a minor third interval. This is 3 half steps. You can see this in action if you look at the notes in the C major scale. Start on the first note C, skip a note to E, then skip a note to G. As you know, these are the 3 notes in the C major triad. Now if you keep going and skip the next note, you end up on B. This note can be labelled with a 7. That's because it's a major 7th interval above the root note C. Major 7th intervals span 11 half steps. Another way of thinking about this note is that it's just half a step below the root note. Add this to the C major triad and you have a C major 7th chord. Major 7th chords therefore have 4 notes, written as 1, 3, 5 and 7. They have a smooth, relaxing sound, which has strong associations with jazz. You'll typically see major 7th chords written with MAJ7 after the chord letter. They also appear with a capital M and the number 7. In major keys, you can naturally play the 1 chord and the 4 chord as major 7ths. This means that you can replace any of these chords with the major 7th version in your progressions without any problems. You can create a classic soft jazz ending to your songs by ending on the 1 major 7 chord. Here's an example in the key of C major. You can vary your 1 chords between standard triads and major 7ths to generate this smoother feel whenever it suits your song. This is an idea the Red Hot Chili Peppers used in the verse of their 1991 song Under the Bridge. It's built on a 1-5-6-4 progression using standard chords. After the final repeat before the chorus, the song lingers on the 1 major 7th chord, which provides a relaxing break and change in feel. This was an idea also used by Mark Bolan in the song Rip Off by T-Rex. Here's a similar idea in the key of C major. John Lennon used this contrast between the 1 major triad and the 1 major 7th in the song Imagine. It uses the 1 chord for 3 beats of the first bar, before briefly playing the 1 major 7th for a single beat and then moving to the 4 chord second inversion. This allows the bass to stay on the same root throughout. Here's a similar example in the key of C major. I mentioned the other diatonic major 7th chord in major keys was on the 4 chord, so let's look at how to use that now. Much like the 1 major 7th, you can just substitute the 4 chord for the major 7th version wherever you find it in your progressions. For example, here's the 1-5-6-4 again, with the major 7th this time. Listen to the smooth draw back to the 1 chord this creates. Arguably the most common use of the 4 major 7th is to simply pair it with the 1 major 7th. Gently moving between these two chords creates a smooth, warm, comfortable feeling that has graced many a soft or yacht rock ballad sailing off into the sunset. It also features in the beginning of Eric Satie's Gymnopédie 1. Here's how that sounds. Major 7th chords also appear diatonically in natural minor keys. You might also know this as the Aeolian mode. They can be played as the 3 and 6 chords. Be aware these chords are also known as flat 3 and flat 6 relative to the major key. A really common and pleasing use of major 7 in minor keys is when moving from the 1 to 6 major 7. This was also used by the Red Hot Chili Peppers in the pre-chorus section of Californication. Here's how that sounds in the key of A minor. An interesting fact about major 7th chords is that they actually contain a minor triad. Earlier in the video I discussed the major triad. Minor triads have the same formula but use a minor third interval. You'll see this written as 1, flat 3, 5. Minor third intervals span 3 half steps, so if you know what a major third note is, you can just drop it by half a step and arrive at the minor third. This means if you take the notes in the E major triad and drop the third note by half a step, you create an E minor triad. This has the notes E, G and B. I showed you the C major 7th chord earlier with the notes C, E, G and B. So if I remove the C root note, then you are left with an E minor triad. This could be used in a variety of ways, some of which I'll explore later, so hang around for that. For now, I'll play a simple E minor triad 4 times on the guitar. After 2 bars, the bass will move from E to C. Listen to how this pulls the progression from the E minor chord to the C major 7th chord. This is a 3 to 1 major 7 progression in the key of C major. Now I'll move on to the minor 7th chord. If you take a minor triad and add a minor 7th interval to it, then you create a minor 7th chord. This is written as 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7. Minor 7th chords are notated with a small m and the number 7. For example, you know that E minor has the notes E, G and B. If you add a D note to this, then it becomes an E minor 7th chord. If you count up from E to D, then it is 10 half steps. This is a minor 7th interval. You can also arrive at this note by counting down a whole step, which is 2 half steps, from the root note. Here's how the chord sounds. This is like a calmer, more relaxed minor chord. It's not quite as sad as the stark minor triad. Minor 7th chords are popular in lots of genres, particularly jazz and reggae. They are easy to use and versatile. You can substitute any of the 3 diatonic minor chords in major or minor keys with minor 7th versions without any issue. For example, listen to this 2-chord loop in the key of A minor. On the first repeat, I'll use basic triads. Then I'll play them as minor 7ths. Listen to how this lightens the mood and elevates the progression. Like the major 7th, minor 7th chords also contain another triad within them. In this case, it's a major triad. Look again at the notes in the E minor 7 chord, E, G, B and D. If I take away the root note E, then you are left with G, B and D. These are the notes in the G major triad. This means you can add the note that is a minor third interval, 3 half steps, below the root note of any major triad to the chord, and then use this as a new root to create a minor 7 chord. In the next example, I'll repeatedly play the G major triad on guitar. For the first two bars, the bass will play a G note. Then in the second two bars, the bass will shift to play an E note. Listen to how this reveals the minor seventh sound with the change of a single note. This hidden triad goes some way to explain the brighter feel of the minor seventh chord compared to the standard minor triad. It also allows you to explore interesting ideas and move in and out of seventh chords within your songs. I've done this a couple of times already with the major and minor sevenths and changing bass lines. I'll do this again in the next example, but you could introduce or take away notes with any instrument in your composition, including a voice or a melody line. In the next example, I'll play the basic E minor triad on guitar, with the notes E, G and B. For the first two bars, the bass will play the root note E, then it will shift to D, which creates an inverted E minor 7 chord. Interestingly, if you play an inverted minor 7th chord with the flat third note in the bass, it has the same notes as a major 6th chord. Then finally, the bass will descend to C to flesh out a C major 7th chord. This bass line descends in whole steps, and the resulting chords create a 3 to 3 minor 7 to 1 major 7 progression in the key of C major. Here's how that sounds. Now you know about major and minor 7th chords, you're free to use them anywhere in your progressions. Because they can be used as 5 of the 7 diatonic chords in major and minor keys, you can easily substitute them into your existing progressions. This can be great for adding some depth or interest, and is something you'll see all over popular music, such as in September by Earth, Wind and Fire. For example, have a listen to this 1-6-2-4 progression in the key of C major. On repeat, I'll swap out all of the chords for their 7th chord equivalent. Listen to how much fuller this sounds. Next up is the dominant 7th chord. The dominant 7th chord is like a hybrid of the previous two 7th chords. You take a major triad and add a minor 7th interval to it. This is written as 1, 3, 5, flat 7. For example, C dominant 7th has the notes C, E, G and B flat. Dominant 7th chords are written in notation with a 7 after the chord letter. Some people call them major minor 7th chords, which describes the formula, but most commonly they'll be called simply 7th or 7 chords. They have a unique major tension that is grittier and more unsettled than the standard major triad. Dominant 7th chords feature diatonically as the 5 chord in major keys. You may know that the 5 chord in major keys is also called the dominant chord. This is where the 7 chord gets its name and primary use from. When it is played, it strongly wants to resolve to the 1 chord, in what is known as the authentic or perfect cadence. A cadence is a chord progression of at least 2 chords that ends a phrase or section of a piece of music. It ends with the resolution of tension, providing a feeling of completion. The standard 5 triad works well in this resolution, but making it a dominant 7th chord turbocharges the cadence. Listen to the difference in the next example in the key of C major. So why does the dominant 7th chord make this cadence so much stronger? Let's have a look at the notes under the hood to learn more. The 1 chord C major has the notes C, E and G. The 5 chord G major has the notes G, B and D, and if you play it as a dominant 7th, it also has an F note. When thinking about how notes move between chords, you can use a concept called voice leading. There are many associated rules with this idea, but my only thought in this example is about finding notes that are the shortest distance from each other. The obvious starting point is the G note, as it's the same between the 2 chords, so there's no movement. Next up is the B note in the G chord. The nearest note to this in the C chord is the root note C. They are only half a step or semitone apart. This is the smallest distance in Western music and creates the most tension. In this case, the B note is known as the leading note or tone. It is leading strongly to the root note of the relevant scale. Listen to the notes in the C major scale and the feeling you get when B is played. It is yearning to move up to the C note. This strength of movement is what makes the 5-to-1 cadence so satisfying. The one remaining note is D. D is an equal distance apart from C and E. Because of this, and the fact that the distance is a whole step or tone, it has a much weaker sense of pull and movement. So you can see, in order to better show this movement and make it easier to play on the piano, I've changed the order of the notes in the G major chord. As a G note is still played in the bass, this is still a standard G chord. I made another video on the channel about voice leading if you want to learn more. Let's have a listen to the 5-to-1 cadence again. If you use the dominant 7th version of 5, it has a greater tension and supercharges the cadence. Look at the example of G dominant 7th to understand why. The added F note is only half a step away from the E note, so it's another leading tone. This means the cadence now contains 2 leading tones, strengthening the pull and desire to resolve to the 1 tonic chord. Have another listen to it now. Dominant 7th chords also feature diatonically in minor keys as the 7 chord. This can provide an interesting resolution to the 1 tonic chord. Here's an example in the key of A minor. Arguably the most common use of dominant 7th chords in minor keys is as the 5 chord. This is the same as in major keys. This chord can be called borrowed because it has been borrowed from the parallel major key. I've got other videos on the channel which look at this idea in more detail. Using the dominant 7th instead of the diatonic minor 5 chord creates a stronger cadence and greater sense of resolution. In the next A minor key example, I'll play the minor 5 to 1 change followed by 5 dominant 7th to 1 so you can appreciate the difference. Dominant 7th chords contain 2 interesting structures within them. The first is between the 3rd and flat 7 note. This interval of 6 half steps, or 3 whole tones, is called a tritone. It's the most dissonant and tense of the intervals. This extreme tension is hidden and diluted somewhat when contained within the dominant 7th chord, giving the chord the edge it is associated with. Listen to this in the next example. First I'll play the tritone, created with the notes B and F. Then I'll fill out the rest of the G dominant 7th chord, so you can hear how it contains this sound. The other structure is revealed if you remove the bass note from the dominant 7th chord. This leaves the notes for a diminished triad. This is common with the 3 7th chord types explored so far in this video, which each had a different triad contained in the top 3 notes. For example, if you look at the notes in the G dominant 7th chord again, the top 3 notes are B, D and F. These are the notes in the B diminished triad, which is the 7 chord in the key of C major. In this context, diminished triads can be seen as rootless dominant 7th chords. For more information about this and other diminished chords, check out another video I made on the channel. I've shown you some ways to use the dominant 7th chords, particularly to enhance cadences. But you'll also see them used liberally in blues and rock, in all sorts of positions in progressions. In fact, many songwriters will play any major chord as a dominant 7th. This will give your progressions an edge and toughness. Because most of these uses are not diatonic and therefore introduce notes from outside of the relevant key. For example, a simple progression using 1, 4 and 5 chords could look like this if played with all dominant 7th chords. Similar ideas could be used within a 12-bar blues structure. Here's how that sounds in the key of C major. final 7th chord to feature diatonically in major and minor keys is the minor 7 flat 5. As the name suggests, this is just a minor 7th chord with a flattened or diminished 5th note. For this reason, it's also called a half diminished chord. They feature whatever diminished triads do in their respective keys, so that's as the 7 chord in major keys and the 2 chord in minor keys. You can learn more about these in the diminished video I referenced earlier, which I'll also link at the end of this video, but I'll show you a couple of simple uses for them now. In major keys, you can use these chords as simple substitutes for the 5 chord, for example in the key of C major. In minor keys, you can use them as a predominant chord before the borrowed 5 dominant 7. Here's how that could look in the key of A minor. Now you know about the 4 main types of 7th chord, it's time to think about using them in a song. I've looked at different ways to use the 4 7th chords throughout this video, but how would they work in an entire song? I'll use some of these ideas now to write a full song. It'll be in the key of A minor, at a mid-tempo of 100 BPM with a 4/4 time signature. This should allow the nuance of the beautiful 7th chords to shine through. In terms of song structure, I'm going to use Sting's favourite.
And once I have a structure of a song, maybe a traditional structure, verse, chorus, bridge, key change, coda, that's the ideal for me, even though it's not terribly fashionable at the moment.
The song starts with a bass lick. This bass lick will run through the song as a common thread. In the intro bar, it plays the notes for the A minor 7th chord. This sets up the key of the song with the 1 chord and the feel of minor 7th. The piano just plays the 1st and 5th of the chord to allow the bass to spell out the chord quality. This could also be called an A power chord. Then the song moves into the verse. The verse is focused mainly on minor chords, whereas the chorus will focus more on major chords. This will allow a greater contrast to be felt between song sections. In the first 3 bars of the verse, I play a simple 1-4-5 progression. Each chord lasts a single bar and there are no 7th chords used. This means that when they are introduced later in the song, they have a bigger impact. In bar 4, I return to the 1 chord, A minor, but this time in second inversion. So it shares a bass note with the 5 chord. Then this changes after half a bar to the first inversion with the C bass note. Bar 5 returns to the 4 chord D minor, and then I play the first of the 7th chords with the 2 minor 7 flat 5. This is played like the intro chord with a simple perfect 5th interval on the piano and the bass spelling out the full chord with the rhythmic lick. This chord is acting as a predominant, leading the listener to the 5 chord E minor again. Then you hear the E minor 7 chord. Listen to the smooth drama this brings as it's played on the piano and the bass plays through the rising notes of the chord, leading into the pre-chorus. The pre-chorus doubles the chord lengths and is all about showcasing the 7th sound. It uses the idea from Californication that I discussed earlier. The A minor 7 chord is played straightforwardly on the piano, with the bass playing the root note A. The F major 7th chord is split by playing the A minor triad notes on the piano and the F note in the bass. This gives the chord a starker, more open feel. Throughout, the guitar plays A minor arpeggios. Moving into the chorus and the song changes to a major focus. It starts with the 7 chord G major and the 6 chord F major. This change also introduces a more syncopated feel with offbeat chord changes. At the same time, the bass uses the original bass lick rhythm to underlay this new section. The second bar brings in the borrowed E dominant 7th chord. You really hear the dramatic nature this brings to the song. It wants to resolve to the 1 chord, but this is delayed until the second half of the chorus. In bar 4 of the chorus, the final major chord from the key is brought in. The bar is split between C major and C major 7th, with a different piano play style to highlight this smooth major sound. Then after the next 5 dominant 7th chord, the 1 chord A minor is finally played to provide some relief. This is followed by the A minor 7th chord to continue the relaxing 7th sound, followed by the 5 minor 7th chord. This is interrupted for a single beat at the end of the chorus with the 5 dominant 7th chord to add a glimpse of tension before returning back to the verse. After everything repeats, I then move to the bridge. The main goal of the bridge is to build up towards a key change to take us out on. But before it gets there, it introduces some new ideas to make it stand out from the rest of the song. First up is the use of the dominant 7th 7 chord. This provides some nice diatonic tension. Then there's an injection of movement from A minor to A minor 7th on each beat. This sound is reinforced by the bass moving from the root note A to the flat 7th note G. The first bar repeats, and then the F major 7th chord is played for a bar. The bass walks through all 4 notes of this chord. The first 2 bars are then repeated. After this, I'm looking to set up the key change. I'm heading towards the E flat major key to end on a more upbeat note. You can see the key change uses the B diminished 7 chord and the B flat dominant 7th chord to reach our destination. If you want to learn why this works, then watch the video linked to after the song. Once the key change has happened, the outro starts with a simple 1-6-2-5 progression. The piano and guitar just play these simple triads twice for the whole 8 bars, but the bass switches up after the first 4 bars to reharmonize the progression. I showed you some of this earlier in the video. This ultimately leads the final 4 bars to use the chords 6 minor 7, 4 major 7, 2, 3 minor 7, bringing back the smooth mellow 7th chords you've learned all about. Finally, we drift out with the 1 major 7th chord, E flat major 7. Diminished chords are critical to understand 7th chords. Watch the video on screen next to learn all about them.